Welcome all. This is the fourth and final talk of this Tech Freedom Policy Summit. Once again, I am Corbin Barthold, Internet Policy Counsel here at Tech Freedom. I also happen to be the host of the Tech Policy Podcast, and this is doubling as a special live taping of the show. I'm pleased and honored to be joined by Quinta Jurecic. She's a fellow at the Brookings Institution, a senior editor at Lawfare, a contributing writer at The Atlantic, and more, as if that weren't already enough. Two major themes of this event have been, first, the decline of trust in experts and institutions, and second, a concomitant rise in populism, demagoguery, and extremism. Behind both of these themes lies the disconcerting possibility that the internet is helping drive this recrudescence or renaissance of what Philip Roth called indigenous American berserk. Quinta and I are going to close things out by looking at these subjects through the lens of the January 6th hearings, the interplay between extremist groups and social media, and some of the emerging and disturbingly asymmetric threats to democracy. Quinta, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Let's just dive right in and start with the January 6th hearings. Incredibly important and informative event in, I would say, the history of American society and governance. And yet at the same time, I have kids and I don't get a lot of sleep and I've got a job. And so I think I'm like a lot of Americans where I'm like, oh man, I should be watching some of that. And you know, I've got a life to lead. So if you could start by giving us, and this is such a mean way to start, a brief recap and, well, you know, what is going on there and why does it matter?
Sure, absolutely. It's an easy question.
Good.
No, in all seriousness, what the committee I think has been doing with, I would argue, pretty astonishing effectiveness is setting out what it has found about January 6th over the course of its investigation. This is kind of a midway point. We're still expecting a final report sometime in the fall before they wrap up their work in January. They have uncovered an enormous amount of new material, more than I certainly expected at the beginning. And what I think they've been able to do really effectively is pull out a couple themes, I would argue, about President Trump's personal culpability. So first, I think, you know, it's often a question, how much was he involved? What did he know and when did he know it? To quote the old Watergate canard. I think it's very clear from their investigation that this is efforts to overturn the election were something that Trump was involved in at every stage. People told him no again and again, and he kept pushing forward to try to block the counting of votes, to overturn the counting of votes, to block the certification of the electoral vote, and finally to incite the riot itself. Second, I think there's also the question, which is related to that, of Trump's personal criminal culpability. If you had asked me a month or two ago, you know, do I think that Trump broke the law around January 6th in the run-up and on the day itself, I would have said, I'm not sure. Now it seems, I think, abundantly clear that the degree of personal involvement rises to the level of what I would certainly comfortably call incitement under the law, and potentially other crimes as well, involving obstruction of Congress, efforts to block the certification of the electoral vote, and so on. So I think the committee has been extraordinarily effective in kind of sketching that portrait, bringing new information to light, really driving home just how unbelievably dangerous January 6th was, and also, you know, how the danger that something similar may happen in the future if this kind of conduct isn't stopped.
So there are some threads in there that are very interesting about criminal justice and the interplay of sort of politics and law as they relate to the discrete actions of Donald Trump that are worth diving into, but kind of not the direct aspect of this event. I mean, what is actually more interesting to me, and as the hearing covered this, for present purposes, I should clarify, we know there's this force at the top doing the top-down misinformation and actions. To what degree have we learned about the bottom-up role of social media or the internet or online organization leading up to January 6th?
It's a great question. It's actually something that I'm surprised the committee hasn't done more on. Initially, I think listeners might know there have been reports about the committee reaching out to folks, wanting to know what the role of tech platforms might have been about bottom-up organizing. As you say, they've really been very focused on the actions of Trump himself and the people around him. And I think that that is a intentional decision by them to kind of keep the focus. That said, it's absolutely true that the role of the internet, the role of this kind of bottom-up organizing enabled by the connectivity of many platforms is something that has kind of permeated the discussion that the committee has been having at every stage. So for example, I think that the most explicit manifestation of this was in the most recent hearing. They actually featured anonymized testimony from a former Twitter employee saying that they had essentially tried to warn others at the platform if they did not take away Trump's Twitter access that violence might result on January 6th. Obviously, the platform didn't step in, and we all know what happened. It's a little hard to evaluate that testimony without knowing, who this person is, what their role was at Twitter, what other kinds of internal conversations there were. But I think that kind of brought to the fore this question of what role do social media platforms, what role did the internet have? Another manifestation of that we saw was actually in the committee's discussion of the Trump campaign's kind of blasting out misinformation about the election to its followers. So they pointed to the really just relentless drumbeat on the part of the campaign of saying, these are falsehoods, these are, the election was stolen, to people who had donated to that campaign, blasting them out across the web, and sort of pointing to that as a way that the campaign was able to spin this narrative of a stolen election and really build that into people's conceptions of what was going on. That being said, even though I do think that this is an unbelievably important component of how we should understand the insurrection, it hasn't really been at the focus of what the committee has been doing.
So I applaud you in a lot of your work on the covering the hearings. You have been the person making the case for, I might call it, sincerity and lack of cynicism, if that works. It's saying, what, these are actually important, they matter, good work is being done. And I'm so glad somebody's doing that, which of course is my nice intro to now push back and be the cynical person. So you actually did a podcast. I recommend the Lawfare podcast, the title of which was The Most Intense Online Disinformation Event in American History. And what was really funny about that is when I dove in and listened to it, I realized it was about the lead up to the election itself. So it was the most until like a month later when the post-election then beat the record. So if that kind of operation can lead a huge portion of a single party to, I forget the exact percentages, but believe, an election was stolen. And in my naiveness, like I would never have guessed that you could rock the polls on a question like that drastically, that quickly. There's a lot going on there, but a lot of those same forces are now at play against the committee itself. I actually will quote you. The committee has presented Trump and his campaign's approach to selling the big lie as essentially a project of spamming, drowning out the facts of what really happened and the possibility of understanding that truth with an endless barrage of falsehoods. I mean, that's exactly what they're doing with the committee, right? So, I guess my question is, how firm are you in that optimism? I mean, isn't the exact same playbook likely to, have kind of similar results?
So first off, I want to give a shout out to Jacob Schultz, who just recently left us as Lawfare's managing editor. He brought to my attention that point about spam, and I think it's a really important one. I think, when it comes to this question of optimism, I've seen passed around a lot the quote recently from Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, right? I would say that my optimism about this is less complacency or a belief that everything is going to turn out okay, and more an insistence that it's only going to matter if we, meaning journalists, the American people, the committee force it into mattering and insist that it does matter. I do think that the committee has really done an astonishing job at making that case. I mean, I'm blown away. I think when they started, I was certainly with a group of people saying, you know, they're going to be facing this barrage from Trump. They're going to be facing, you know, an avalanche of tweets. They're going to be dealing with misinformation coming out every night from Fox, OANN, Newsmax. You know, how are they possibly going to break through that? Especially if you compare it to the Watergate hearings, which is sort of, you know, a television event that really captivated the country. But of course, that predates you know, the enormous amount of different avenues of information that we now have, that's sort of less possible to tell a single national story. That said, I think they have done an extraordinarily good job, really in making the hearings into kind of a media event. They've hired a former president of ABC News to sort of help them build this as a you know, a television series. If you read news coverage of it, you'll see reporters noting, you know, there's a clear narrative in every episode, so to speak. There are clear heroes and villains. There's a arc of the story. You'll see that they do sort of little teasers at the end. You know, next week on insurrection, here's what we're going to show. And I think it's easy to laugh at that and make fun of that as sort of, you know, how terrible it is that we have this issue that goes straight to the heart of the strength of our democracy, and the committee needs to turn it into entertainment for people to pay attention. On the other hand, you know, I don't think that thinking about the medium along with the message is necessarily a bad thing. They do seem to be breaking through. I don't think we have firm evidence from, you know, polling about whether they've changed people's minds, but there's some really interesting reporting about Trump's own perspective, where Maggie Haberman at the New York Times has reported he's angry that nobody is up there to defend him in front of the committee. He feels like, because among other things,
Kevin McCarthy.
Exactly.
Well done.
Right. There aren't pro-Trump Republicans on the panel. The committee has been very careful in only bringing live witnesses who are friendly. You know, they're not, Stuart Rhodes, the leader of the Oath Keepers, offered to show up in person. I think they did not go for that one for a good reason. And so they've been very successful in sort of putting forward this tightly scripted, engaging narrative that Trump doesn't really have a clear counter to, because in part, he's banned from Twitter. You can, you know, he posts on Truth Social and you can see his posts on his website, but he doesn't really have an effective counter. And so, you know, I think it's too early now to say the committee has been effective in all the ways we would want it to be effective, but I think that the signs are much better than I would have expected.
Your answer is actually very, it ties into an earlier panel. FTC Commissioner Noah Phillips and I were talking about how do you make people interested in, you know, sort of the nuts and bolts of good governance instead of whatever is the clickbaity outrage thing of the moment. And I think actually it's like, well, the committee is meeting the culture where it is. And there's a lot to be said for that. And there's actually a weird parallel here. After they made news up in Idaho, I'd never heard of Patriot Front, white supremacist group. And I was just digging around like, who are these crazy people? Going on the internet, like their website is slick. Like their videos are slick. Like they've clearly put a media game together. And so and one of the themes I, you know, mentioned or alluded to in the intros, the asymmetry here of if that's the game one side is playing, well then, you know, it actually behooves you to be slick in return. And I think maybe there's a sense that there's a certain gaucheness to that. Maybe we just have to kind of let go of it. I don't know.
I think there's really is something to that. I mean, I will say I've been, you know, focused on Trump scandals for a long time now. And if you compare what the committee is doing to, you know, the media environment around the Mueller report, I think the difference is astonishing. So I don't know how many people here watched the Mueller hearing, but it was 8 hours of Mueller, who is not, you know, a particularly charismatic speaker, sitting before Congress and essentially answering
looks
yes
a bit
or
like
no.
Sam the Eagle, you know, the,
Right.
the blue eagle on the Muppets.
So there's an appeal to that, right? But maybe not riveting television for hour after hour after hour. And I do think that there is a sort of a bit of a lessons learned that we might be seeing in how the committee has taken care to fashion a message. At the same time, you're absolutely right. I think that, you know, we think about packaging a message as a sign of inauthenticity. I was thinking while watching the hearings, the novelist David Foster Wallace has this great argument in an essay called E Unibus Plurum, so out of one many, arguing that television is a sort of inherently cynical and ironic medium because it presents a visual alongside language,
This
and
was
those
back in
undercut
the
one
90s
another.
of
Yes.
Kill your television bumper stickers. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, he was ahead of the curve. But so I think the question then is, you know, can we look at television and can we look at this sort of slick presentation as a tool for good? And I don't know the answer to that, but the committee's certainly trying.
So you're talking about proliferating information. It was interesting right in there. You took a pretty firm stance on the topic of is banning Trump from Twitter effective? That was interesting. Maybe you can talk on that more in response to what I'm saying, or let it slide. But we've been very focused on what can you say on Twitter? What can you say on Facebook? And for the topic of extremism and the internet, I think that just seems very limited to me at this point. I'll go to another Lawfare podcast. It was with Brian Fishman, and he said, you know, if you're a would-be domestic terrorist, you're going to use one platform to host content, another platform to develop an audience, another for secure communications, another for financing, another to gather information about whether you're going to attack. I forget, it's depressing that like there's so many of these shootings that I forget specifically which one it was that he did all this stuff. He had no Facebook account. He popped onto Facebook to live feed the shooting. It was like his first appearance and made it very difficult for Facebook because it was not some guy with a history where it's like, oh, this guy might be, so like, it was like his first post. So this is a much broader problem that just discussions of content moderation you're not getting at the full picture. So do you have thoughts on, you know, the devil of a problem this is and what kind of approach we should be taking?
Yeah, so that podcast that you're referencing with Brian Fishman, that was right after the Buffalo shooting. So I think his point is important and sobering, as you say. You know, it's not enough. I think that members of Congress, for example, often will focus on one particular platform or, you know, a suite of big platforms, right? Twitter, Facebook, Google, and ignore the fact that this is an entire ecosystem. As Brian pointed out, I think that, you know, this is an environment where the Buffalo shooter, for example, it was really hard for, even just looking at things after the fact, for platforms to work together to take down the live stream of the shooting before Twitch removed it, but the video clips circulated, as well as the shooter's manifesto, precisely because they were spread all over the internet. You know, we now have the GIF-CT collaborating more and more post Christchurch to, you know, work together to hash this kind of material, to take it down across the big platforms. But one of the things that you saw, and there's been reporting on this, is that the video and the manifesto kept popping up on websites that were not big platforms, that were, you know, little file sharing services that aren't part of GIF-CT. And that makes it extraordinarily difficult as a problem. I do think that there's, you know, often a temptation to say, nerd harder, right? Surely you can figure this out if you only do enough math. And I think what Brian's point is, and I definitely recommend that people take a listen to that podcast because I thought it was a really good and sobering discussion, is that at a certain point, you know, you've mathed all the math you can math, and you end up with this unbelievably difficult policy problem. That doesn't mean that we can't do better, but it does mean that, you know, the steps that need to be taken are often not very clear and are just really mechanically hard.
An ongoing hot topic is when we see radicalism online, on, you know, the alternative platforms where it's very easy to find these days. Are we seeing correlation, or are we seeing causation? Are we just being exposed to extremism that was already there, or are we watching it fester as a result of new online communication? And I think it's pretty clear. There's not some definitive answer. We're still hashing it out. But do you have thoughts on it? And I think, do you think it's resolvable, or are we just kind of stuck? I mean, is that just going to be beyond our ken to figure out?
Right. I mean, I think it's hard because it's totally non-falsifiable, right?
Yeah.
There's no alternative universe that we can look at and say, in a world without 4chan, right? What do things look like? I think the counterexample that I often think of when pondering through this question is, if you recall, very early in the 2016 election, I want to say the summer of 2016, around the time when broader public audience was sort of first being exposed to a lot of the far right online communities that were very supportive of Trump. You may remember Hillary Clinton put out an explainer on her website about Pepe the Frog. that was a real landmark moment in American politics. I think there was a lot of anxiety, reasonably so, to be clear, about these communities and what they meant. And that in some cases became transformed into, these communities are what created Trump. These communities are what is driving his popularity and what elected them. I think if you go back and look at a lot of that writing now, and I shouldn't let myself off the hook here, I think I wrote some of that as well, I don't think it really holds up. That there were vile people who were hanging out in vile corners of the internet who were very enthusiastic about Trump's campaign, but that's a completely separate thing from what actually got him elected. And I think it's maybe easy to focus on what you're looking at when you turn over the rock, as opposed to everything else that's in plain sight around the rock. Now, again, I don't want to, let us off the hook here in the other direction either. I do think that there are serious questions about the extent to which, the ability of people to easily connect with one another can obviously be used by people to, turn in bad directions as well as good ones. If we're talking about the Buffalo shooter, the speed with which that manifesto spread, the fact that it referenced other far-right extremist manifestos from across the globe is also, I think a great argument for the danger of that kind of connectivity, which, as we've said, platforms have tried to add some friction into, but can't completely stop. It's really, really hard to say. And so I do think that, your question gets to something important. In a way, are we just going around in circles here? Maybe so. I mean, I have come to think that at the end of the day, the question is really one of human nature. And perhaps it's easier for policymakers to frame this as a question of the internet rather than of human nature. Because if you ask, well, what can Congress do about human nature? The answer is not very much.
Well, and, to give, I guess, a word for the devil, it's a lot easier to say, look at these platforms where people can talk to each other and rile each other up, and to say, what did we do to lose people's trust? Or, so like any complex phenomenon, it is very unlikely to be unicausal. And if you and I were to pick apart, the 10 different factors, it's like, well, the answer is all of the above, and we're debating over like how much of each one. And a similar one like that, another hot dispute is it effective to deplatform radicals from the mainstream platforms? And the way I've always put it is, I care about the answer to that question, but I don't care about it in connection to whether the platform should be allowed to do it. I'm a firm believer in the notion that mainstream platforms have a right to say, well, not on our watch. Like, it's not going to happen because we sat here and allowed it. And they have the right to make that decision. But the question is, as you know, the sort of counter talking point, at least, is you're just pushing people into their little holes where they're going to write, it's an echo chamber, and you're just sort of distilling the radicalization instead of exposing it to alternative views. So what about that one?
The great and maybe frustrating thing about some of these questions is that they have empirical answers, right? These are things that we can study. And there's been a lot of really interesting studies that you've started to see come out over the last few years as platforms have become, more aggressive in taking that opportunity to kick people off their platforms, to take a look and say, was this effective? Did it just radicalize people further? Did it help clean up conversation on the main platform? So I took a look at this back when, I can't remember quite when it was. It might have been 6 months or so after Trump was banned from Twitter and Facebook after the insurrection. And generally speaking, I think the academic work suggests that banning people from these platforms is effective in that it kind of cleans up the conversation, so to speak, on those platforms. So one example that there's been studies of is Reddit's action in banning various really noxious forums, racist forums. There's one that's very pleasantly called Our Fat People Hate, so you can guess what that one is like. And essentially the question is, okay, we got rid of these forums. Did the people who were on those forums continue to post elsewhere on Reddit? Were they as vile in those other posts? Did you just kind of shunt them from one place to the other? Generally speaking, if I'm remembering the study correctly, it did succeed in driving those folks off Reddit, and the people who were still on Reddit were not quite as nasty in the other communities in which they were involved. There's also been studies of what happened after Reddit banned the subreddit r/the_Donald, which had become sort of a real cesspool of right-wing extremism. So there was briefly another website that was created as a kind of refuge from folks from that subreddit called thedonald.win. And so again, you can kind of look at what are the conversations like, if you compare them across the subreddit and this new website, generally, again, there were fewer people, I think, on the donald.win. So, that's a success. There were some questions about, are the folks on the donald.win, are they becoming more radical in their beliefs? And if I'm remembering correctly, there were some questions about whether that was the case. And this is something that, we kind of know about a little bit already, because there has been research on this from researchers who focused on Islamist extremists when, the first time we were having this argument about banning folks from these major platforms around the rise of ISIS, what happens if you kick people off Twitter? Does that disrupt the network? Again, the answer seems to be generally yes. And the kind of workarounds that ISIS propagandists found to stay on Twitter, like creating a lot of new accounts, locking their accounts, essentially made their propaganda less effective because Twitter couldn't find it, but neither could anyone else. On the other hand, it does seem like, for some people that did sort of drive them farther into the corner that they'd already headed into. So I don't think there's a clear answer, but I do think it's notable that, the academic work that we've seen so far suggests that at least in some ways, that kind of deplatforming can actually be effective.
Yeah, one other I'll throw in there. I do know when Alex Jones was booted, they found that was effective in getting people to stop talking about crisis actors at Sandy Hook on Twitter. That's a great answer and very informed. The tough thing, not because anybody can answer this, to be clear, this is what makes it just unanswerable, is we live in a dynamic world, right? Each player gets a turn. So even if you're effective today at cleaning up this platform and that platform, there are motivated actors who will find a new way to go somewhere that welcomes them, or to come up with a new form of communication. And that is my segue into talking about what I would probably call a problem from hell, which is Steve Bannon. His War Room show is extraordinarily popular. And the thing that I find frustrating about him is the thing that he's so brilliant at, which is it's all just so asymmetrical. It kind of reminds me, to use a weird litigation analogy, of how sometimes it was actually easier to litigate against a really good attorney who, they're going to be really smart. They're not going to miss anything, but they're going to have a brief that has like 3 arguments. They're going to be like, here's one, here's the other, and here's the third. And it's like, they're going to be really good, but like, that's what I'm addressing. Okay, like I've got my tasks set for me. And we know Bannon's famous phrase about what he wants to do with the zone and what he wants to flood it with. And that's, so sometimes you have the lawyer who just throws everything at the wall, and you're actually kind of on the mercy of the good judgment of the judge at that point, because the limited nature of reality and word limits and time and effort being what it is, I think it's been said, it takes 10 times more effort to counter BS than to come up with it. And he's the ultimate BS machine. At the same time, it's clear you just have to admit from his success, he's tapping into something very real in people's minds. And, there's plenty of people who are ranting on the sidewalk who don't get followings like that. So he's doing something right by his lights. We are in a situation, we are an open society. We have a First Amendment. We cannot engage in, I'm going to butcher the German, but the straight bear democracy, where it's like, no, we're suspending the rules because you're so good at sort of using our own system against us that we're going to take these emergency measures. So, what do you, this is I'm throwing this at you, what do you do with that? Feel free to just riff on it, but how do we address that? What do we do?
Right. There's another easy question.
Oh, good. Oh, fantastic.
In all seriousness, I do think that, I like the litigation analogy a lot, actually, because one thing I've been spending some time doing recently is looking at some of the wild and crazy litigation filed by Trump campaign and pro-Trump attorneys after the 2020 election.
I was closer to the issue than I thought. Yes.
Yeah. So, and what you see is, they, for example, Sidney Powell's Kraken cases, they file these briefs that are just, hundreds and hundreds of pages of affidavits that are essentially, I saw a guy with a bag walk into a building. And then the poor judge ends up having to sort through that. And you can really see how the judges just become unbelievably frustrated that they have to sort through, all of this garbage, essentially. On the other hand, or maybe not on the other hand, but, to look at the legal system from a different angle, we're talking about Steve Bannon, as we're talking today, the Steve Bannon trial for contempt of Congress is getting moving. They're seating a jury, they're beginning opening arguments, and this, for listeners who may not have followed closely, relates to Bannon's refusal to comply with subpoenas sent by the January 6th committee, essentially saying that basically he didn't have to. And
he basically thought it was optional, is his defense, or at least in terms of the timing.
Yes. And he said very proudly on his show that Nancy Pelosi was going to find that this would be the misdemeanor prosecution from hell, and he was going to use it to, rip into the committee. So far, it may be the misdemeanor prosecution for hell, but that would be for Steve Bannon, not for anyone else. He's not been allowed to haul Nancy Pelosi into the courtroom or anything that he would like. A lot of his defenses have been limited so far. He's been pretty subdued in court. So I actually do think that it is a really interesting example of the legal system kind of coming up against this cascade of garbage. Bannon's podcast and the things he said on his podcast are part of the case against him, that he essentially went on the show and saying, no way I'm complying with this subpoena. That's not great evidence to have introduced against you. I don't want to, give the legal system too many accolades. Obviously, it's far from perfect. And I think there are a lot of complaints, when it comes to, for example, the 2020 election litigation, that legal discipline has moved far too slowly in disciplining a lot of the lawyers who were involved in those cases. At the same time, I do think it is notable that, for all of Bannon's bombast, we do now have this moment where, he's sitting masked in a courtroom, sort of at the mercy of the judge and the jury. And so it will be very interesting to see what comes of that, and how he responds. But it does strike me as sort of an interesting confrontation between the two different immovable objects, so to speak.
Yeah, in my experience, the legal system, it only has two settings. Totally ineffective slap on the wrist and cannonball to your face. There's lots of tax protesters, right? These people who go around and say that because you didn't have the frills right on the flag in the courtroom, that means you don't have jurisdiction or whatever. And it's a whole thing. And a lot of the time what will happen is they'll get away with it and they'll misbehave and they'll miss deadlines and they'll basically thumb their nose at the legal system until something will happen where they're put on trial for some misdemeanor where they're facing 6 weeks, and they'll try to tamper with a juror. And then the feds will come after them and they spend 8 years in prison. That's just an aside that one way these things can happen is some of these people, they thumb their nose and they thumb their nose and they thumb their nose. And then, you know, it's hard to podcast from prison. That said, so that's just one possibility. At the same time, though, so you're right, he gets brought into court and it's not his circus arena anymore, but he leaves the court and it sure is once again. And there's going to be this tale, never mind that it was a Trump appointed judge, you know, they're all in on it is the whole thing. That's true with the election. And Ben Collins of NBC News was very good about this. I mean, I'm sure it's a commonly made point, but the problem with conspiracy theories is they have better stories than reality. And, you know, I don't want to be overly snide or snarky in talking about the crisis of meaning for a lot of people in the country, and where if you are suffering from the worst aspects of our sort of increasing bowling alone effect, and religious institutions and civic institutions and government institutions all are kind of letting you down, and family is disintegrating, and you are looking for meaning, somebody on 4chan with a story that strikes me as totally bonkers may nonetheless be very coherent and meaningful to you, especially if, you know, you're not experienced enough in the world to find it utterly implausible that like a Trump appointed judge is like in the bag for some big conspiracy. So that's all just very bleak. You know, the problem just seems so decentralized and at such a deeper level than any of the sort of technology and stuff that we're dealing with, where it's like, it's almost like a spiritual crisis. And we're just sitting here being like, darn, that's really rough. What are we gonna do?
I think that's right. I mean, I think it reminds me of a lot of what you saw, you know, during the early COVID period, when people were in much greater isolation when they were today, where there was a lot of attraction to QAnon, you know, to various COVID conspiracy theories. In part, it seems because, you know, people were alone. They were looking for connection. They were looking for someone to explain to them what was going on in a very, you know, unhappy and difficult world. And I do think that it's possible to understand that and have sympathy and compassion for that without letting anyone off the hook. I mean, I will say, to go back to what the January 6th committee has been doing, one thing that I think they've been trying to do, I think it's effective, we'll see if it's actually effective, is extending a hand in that way to folks who have been caught up in these conspiracy theories. So one of the witnesses at the most recent hearing was someone who was a Trump supporter, came to believe in the big lie, you know, caught a ride with a friend from where he lived, I think in the Midwest, to DC, you know, was at the Capitol, has been charged criminally. And he was saying essentially, you know, I now see that I was scammed, essentially, you know, I was made to believe this. It was not true. I regret it enormously. I should not have believed that. And, you know, sort of putting this person on display to say, like, this is not a happy story. And this is someone who feels ripped off, essentially. I think, you know, to go back to what I was saying before about the way the committee has focused on the Trump campaign's use of the internet and even of campaign email to spread the big lie. I think the Zoe Lofgren, who's a representative on the committee, used the phrase the big ripoff.
That's such a great way to frame it.
Right. And I think it, you know, the idea, as far as I understand it, is that, you know, it is not attacking the people who believed this on the ground level, but saying you were scammed. You know, you had a reasonable desire to believe in something, to make sense of the world in the way that we all do. And the Trump campaign took advantage of that and, you know, stole from you in some sense, pulled the wool over your eyes, whatever you want to say, you know, left you holding the bag. That strikes me as a really interesting message for the committee to try to put forward. We'll see if it works.
Nothing says false prophet like wearing 3 collared shirts at the same time. So you mentioned the pandemic, and that ties into an amazing article you wrote for The Atlantic called The Great Rage, which it gets at, I love it when there's a piece that, as you read it, it's so straightforward and kind of obvious, but before you read it, it was this nebulous thing in your mind that was not concrete and was just kind of there in the background. I think that's a sign of a really well done article, and that did this. Where certainly with my wife, and there's all this talk of just everybody's a little weird. Have you noticed that? Like, no, I'm not. Forget the all online extremists we've just been talking. Like everybody, and it's showing up in statistics. And your article gets into that a bit, of just that there is a rise of harassment. There's a rise of anxiety and aggravation and like public outbursts and people misbehaving. You write, the ties of basic decency holding American civic life together have become seriously frayed. We have the rise of threats and intimidation toward healthcare workers, towards teachers, towards airline workers. You write, and this is so true, videos of Americans throwing fits because they won't put on a mask have at this point become their own genre. There's a whole genre of like airplane, like live flight fist fights. And going along with that is an upshot, or a rise upward of all of our debates toward a national level. Everything needs to be politicized at a national level. You're right, political scientists have written about the increasing nationalization of American politics, the extent to which national politics shapes local outcomes, and citizens tend to express more interest in national political disputes over local ones. And citizens tend to do that. So, I mean, fantastic article. Could you please, I think I've summarized pretty well, but if you need further, go ahead. And then just, what's going on?
Well, thanks. You're very kind. Yeah, I mean, I think that part of what I was trying to put my finger on is that I think there's an increase in rage around politics, but also just generally. One of the examples that really struck me, and this is from a New York Times report, was of an adult man who threw a fit in a grocery store aisle because the store didn't have the kind of cheese that he wanted. So that may be connected to politics, but not directly, perhaps. So I think that, a lot of it is COVID isolation. Everyone is on edge. But you do see this sort of increasing nationalization of politics and creep of politics into everything, and COVID makes that very immediate. I interviewed recently a couple of emergency room physicians who, are struggling with how to deal with COVID misinformation. And one of the things that they said is that it's really hard to strike up a rapport with a patient, which you need to do quickly if you're in an emergency room because you have a lot of people coming through. If, for example, you come out, you're wearing a mask, the patient's not wearing a mask, and then the well is immediately poisoned because, if they don't believe in masking right away, they don't trust you, whatever their complaint is. And I do think that there's, an extent to which sort of masking makes immediately visible disagreements about, political affiliation, about, if you want to take it up an abstract level, care for one another, how we understand our role as, mutual participants in a society. It just becomes immediately visible. And you see that too in, the harassment of healthcare workers, again, when it comes to questions of masking, of vaccination. Recently, of course, there's been a lot of stories about harassment of librarians at schools and elsewhere, because, people who are angry that libraries are carrying certain books, to do critical race theory or what they think is critical race theory or so on. So there's an extent to which, because national politics has become so polarized and because it's polarized asymmetrically and what one party has become increasingly extreme, you see this take manifestations in terms of interpersonal conflict and harassment. And that, I think, is a very dangerous thing. One thing that really struck me while researching and writing that piece is that, a lot of the stories you hear from people who are the subjects of this harassment, so, healthcare workers, local health commissioners who have quit their jobs because they don't want to deal with that kind of harassment, librarians who have left, election workers, the stories they tell, the sort of cadence of them sounds really familiar with a genre of kind of internet harassment that well predates Trump, of often women, often people of color who, experience horrific online abuse struggled to get the police to take it seriously, ended up stepping back from whatever role they had because of that. And now, you read these stories from election workers and so on who have very similar stories of, people came after me for essentially no reason. I was deluged with threats. They were piling up in my email. People showed up outside of my house. And what struck me is that, again, this is a tendency that has always been there. But it's moved from something that was perhaps more on the periphery to a major part of civic life. And I think it's fair to say a political tactic on the part of one political party.
Yeah. So I've gone back and forth. I have this ambivalence. You have a great one where in the article somebody says, this is America. I don't have to do what you say, to a barista at a Starbucks. And I read that, I was like, well, I mean, that's America. Like, that's just like, we should put that on our flag. And so as I hinted at the intro, I go back and forth between this is something fundamentally new versus this is not to excuse it, but to be like, well, this is who we are. Like, we're Americans. Like, we've always been crazy. Again, Indigenous American Berserk, or Brad Pitt at the end of Killing Them Softly, which predates the pandemic, when he goes, this is America. It's not a country, it's a business. And yet what you've pointed at here, there is something fundamentally different. So I'm going to close with a long but very worthwhile quote from you from this article. Trust in government has suffered a sharp decline over the past 50 years. But a study by the Pew Research Center also found that Americans have lost further trust in other public institutions over the course of the pandemic. One solution for these ills is to encourage greater participation in civic life by idealistic Americans who want to do good. But such encouragement can't help but be undercut by the new norm that people working in a public-facing job or in any role that might excite public interest can expect a potential torrent of abuse at any minute. Many, though not all, stories of health officials, election workers, and school board members inundated with threats end with the person at the center of the storm stepping back from their work in search of some measure of anonymity. Public service, in their view, is no longer worth it, as you alluded to a moment ago. And we now have the internet. It's easy to find people. It's easy to target people for harassment. And going, that quote, I think, is in microcosm the deepest, darkest threat we face from all the themes we've been talking about throughout this event today of distrust and demagoguery and populism, that if the just good citizen Americans on the ground level that none of us have heard of, who make our elections work and make our hospitals work and make our schools work, decide, this is not worth it, we're in a dark, dark place. And so closing out, I'm leaving it in your hands, Quinta. Do you want to double down on that totally dark path I just went on? Do you want to try and end us on an optimistic note? It is up to you.
I don't know if I can be optimistic. I do think that, again, to go back to the January 6th committee, I wrote that article well before the hearing started, but you see them touch on this point. Some of the witnesses that they brought, one, Ruby Freeman, who is an African-American poll worker in Georgia, and her daughter, whose name I'm forgetting, spoke very eloquently and movingly about the harassment that they faced after they were identified by Trump and Rudy Giuliani falsely as having engaged in some kind of election manipulation. And the daughter had to step back. Shay Moss, sorry, that's her name. Shay Moss had to step back from her work as an election worker, which she said, she loved precisely because it allowed her to make ties with the community, help people out. She couldn't do it anymore because of this harassment. And I think it's a really immediate and brutal reminder of the cost that this can have. And especially, and I think it's worth pointing out, the cost to people who only recently have been able to participate fully in American society. I don't think was lost on the committee that these are two Black women in the South testifying about a torrent of abuse they received at the hands of white president and his allies. That is really hard. And looking at that story, it is hard to say, you know, if you're speaking to someone in Georgia in a similar position, would you really tell them keep doing this work? On the one hand, we need that, but on the other hand, the personal cost, as both Moss and Freeman testified to, is extraordinary and extreme. On the other hand, you know, I will say I've over the last few years have had a number of conversations with folks who were in government and left under Trump for various reasons. And a few years ago, had the opportunity to watch one of them speak to a class of students at Georgetown who were thinking about whether they wanted to go into government. These are all students at the School of Foreign Service. And, you know, this former official was telling them, you know, I think it's still worth it. This is someone who'd suffered an enormous amount under the administration, who had really sort of, I think, had their faith in public service tested by what had happened, and who, you know, went out there and said, we need people like you, we need you to step up, you know, you should, you know, keeping in mind everything that happened to me, I still think that you should do this. And so again, maybe we can go back to Gramsci there, right? That there's the only way out of it is that kind of commitment, even though it's an extraordinarily difficult thing to ask of people right now.
Quinta Jurecic, this has been an honor and a privilege. Thank you so much. Follow Quinta's work at The Atlantic and on Lawfare, both written and on the podcast. If there's anything I'm missing, please. That's most of it. Thank you. Okay. I'm Corbin Barthold, Internet Policy Counsel at Tech Freedom. I really want to give a shout out to Tech Freedom. Wonderful organization put on this event today, put on this podcast right now. The Tech Policy Podcast is the podcast of Tech Freedom. So please follow the podcast, follow Tech Freedom on its Substack, Tech Freedom Weekly, follow Twitter, follow Twitter on Tech Freedom, follow Tech Freedom on Twitter, and you know, help us keep doing all the wonderful things the organization does, including conversations like this. And you know, that's it from our Tech Freedom Policy Summit 2022. Till next time, thank you.